financially stronger. And while this feels intuitive, the reality behaves very differently once you look closely at how people actually live, spend, and adapt over time. The middle class, in particular, often sits inside a system where income increases do not translate into proportional increases in long-term financial stability, not because of poor decisions in isolation, but because of a structural pattern that shapes behavior in predictable ways. At first glance, rising income appears to solve most financial constraints. A higher salary reduces immediate pressure, expands access to better housing, improves lifestyle options, and creates the impression of forward movement. However, what often happens beneath the surface is not just an increase in income, but an expansion of financial obligations that grows alongside it. This expansion is not random. It follows a psychological and systemic pattern commonly referred to as lifestyle adaptation, where each increase in income subtly resets the baseline for what feels normal, necessary, and expected. This reset does not feel like a decision. It feels like alignment with a new level of life. A slightly better apartment becomes reasonable. A more convenient commute becomes justified. Upgraded services begin to feel efficient rather than excessive. And small recurring expenses accumulate into fixed monthly structures. Over time, these adjustments transform what was once optional into what feels essential. The result is that higher income gets absorbed into a higher cost structure, often leaving very little difference in actual financial flexibility. From a behavioral perspective, this is not simply about spending more, it is about reducing perceived discomfort. Humans are wired to minimize friction in their daily lives, and additional income provides the ability to remove small inconveniences. The problem is that these micro-adjustments compound. Individually, each change appears rational. Collectively, they reshape the entire financial system a person operates within. If you observe this over a longer time horizon, a pattern emerges where income increases in steps, but expenses quickly stabilize just below that new income level. This creates a narrow margin that rarely expands significantly, even as earnings grow. In practical terms, this means that many individuals remain in a state of continuous financial maintenance rather than transition into a state of financial accumulation. The structural trap here is not visible in short-term snapshots. On a monthly basis, everything appears manageable. Bills are paid, discretionary spending exists, and there may even be some savings, but over extended periods, the absence of meaningful surplus limits the ability to build assets that generate independent growth. Without that separation between income and expenses, financial progress remains tied to continued work rather than system-driven expansion. There is also a social dimension that reinforces this pattern. As income rises, social environments often shift as well. Expectations change subtly through exposure to different standards of living, and comparison begins to operate quietly in the background. People rarely compare themselves to their past, they compare themselves to their current environment. This recalibration increases the likelihood that spending patterns will align with peers rather than long-term financial objectives. Another layer of the middle-class trap lies in how risk is perceived. With higher income and higher fixed expenses, the tolerance for financial disruption often decreases rather than increases. A job loss or income interruption becomes more difficult to absorb because the cost structure is larger and less flexible. This creates a paradox where individuals earning more money may actually feel less secure if their expenses have scaled accordingly. Mathematically, the issue can be understood through the relationship between income growth and savings rate. If income doubles but expenses rise proportionally, the savings rate remains unchanged. However, if expenses rise faster than income in certain periods, the savings rate can even decline despite higher earnings. Over time, this prevents the accumulation of capital that could otherwise compound independently of active income. The key insight is that wealth is not determined by income alone, but by the gap between income and expenses, and more importantly, by how consistently that gap is preserved and allowed to grow. When that gap remains small, even relatively high incomes do not translate into long-term financial independence. Instead, they sustain a higher-cost version of the same financial position. From a systemic point of view, the middle-class trap is not a result of individual failure, but of alignment with a structure that encourages consumption to scale with earning capacity. The system rewards participation and stability, but it does not automatically create surplus. That surplus must be intentionally protected, which requires resisting the natural tendency to convert every increase in income into an increase in lifestyle. The shift out of this pattern does not come from dramatic changes, but from subtle structural awareness. It begins with recognizing that each income increase carries two possible paths. One leads to a higher standard of living with similar financial constraints. The other leads to an expanded gap between income and expenses, which gradually builds financial optionality over time. Most people do not consciously choose between these paths. They drift into one of them through a series of small, reasonable decisions, and that is why the middle class trap is so persistent. It does not feel like a trap. It feels like progress, even when the underlying structure remains unchanged. Understanding this does not require reducing quality of life or rejecting comfort. It requires